Hey guys, welcome to the Stand-Up Review podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're reviewing Eric Andre's 2020 special Legalize Everything. Let's get into it. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to help support the podcast, then head on over to patreon.com/standupreview. With tiers starting at as little as £1, there are some great benefits, such as voting for which specials you want reviewed, Q&As, bloopers, early access to podcasts, exclusive podcasts, and many more. Sign up at patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support. Starting off with a little bit of background, Eric Andre has done a lot of TV work in the past, most notably The Eric Andre Show. This is his first stand-up special. It came out the day before this podcast is coming out. There are a couple of other new specials coming out in the next week or so, which I will be reviewing. I hadn't heard of him before watching this, so I didn't really have any expectation, which, having now seen the show, it's probably best to get an idea of his comedy before you watch it to decide if you are going to enjoy it or not. In terms of his style, there's kind of a rant style of observational comedy. There's a little bit of performance and storytelling in there as well. And he's erratic. I don't know if that really counts as a style of comedy, but erratic is a word that will come up probably a couple of times throughout this review. But with all of that out of the way, let's get into the show itself. For the opening of the show, I'm usually not a fan of video packages before the comic comes on stage, and I don't usually mention them, but this one is really, really good. He keeps it short, but it's really funny. As he comes out, he gets a huge ovation, and he spends a little bit of time introducing the show, but not too much. To start off, he talks about various drugs, and he jumps around different jokes. Nothing really connects any of them, apart from the overall theme of drugs. And it feels a little bit clunky at times. The jokes themselves are fine, but there's nothing really coherent in this bit. Not that there necessarily needs to be, but it just doesn't seem to quite fit together properly. There's then a couple of times where he talks to the audience. The first time he asks a question and just kind of shouts over them, which feels a bit awkward. And the second time he asks a guy a question, then borderline assaults him. It's funny and it kind of helps establish his character, and it really works within the show. In the next bit, he talks about the highest he's ever been in public. There are a couple of really good stories in there that are funny on their own, but the couple of jokes he does add are really great and really improve it. And I've spoken about this before, but when you've got a good story, it's important not to over-embellish it with too many jokes or with jokes that might not be as funny as the story. And Eric does a really good job of displaying how that should be done here. He then goes on to tell various jokes about being progressive or being liberal. And this is really good. It's a group of one-liners that all fit together, but they're really great. Afterwards, he talks about people recognizing him, and there's a couple of really good short stories here. And he uses jokes off to the side of the stories really well, doesn't embellish them too much again. And he knows exactly how much he can get out of a bit, which is probably why a lot of the bits are quite short, but they're as long as they need to be. He goes on again to jump around a few different topics with some really good short bits. None of them are long enough to really be a section on their own, but he groups them together quite well, so as to kind of have them as their own specific bit without them ever being really on one topic. In the next sort of major bit, he talks about Cops, the TV show. And this is very heavily performance-based, but it works really well for the bit. It's really funny. It's a great example of how performance should be incorporated into a comedy show. He sets the bit up with a couple of jokes, then uses the performance to illustrate the joke. And although it's one of the longer parts of the show, it doesn't go on for too long, and the bit builds and builds, and then there's a really great sort of crescendo at the end of it. It's really well written and really well performed. He then tells a short story about hiring a prostitute. It's a really good story. And then at the end, he kind of ruins it a little bit. Not ruins it, that's a bit harsh, but the ending isn't as good as the story itself. But it still works as a whole bit. He then talks about a souvenir he got from Cuba, and he brings out and reads a badly translated sign. And he does well he makes a lot of great jokes off the sign, so he doesn't just read it out and say that it's funny, even though it is. And it's a good example of how to use a prop, but not rely on it or make it feel cheap. And this is probably one of the better parts of the show, which is hard to do a prop comedy because, as I said, it can feel cheap very easily or like you're just pointing out the funny part. But he does a great job of making it his own. He spends some time talking about fast food companies, tells a couple of short stories as a way to get to some jokes, and each of the kind of individual bits, if you split it up like that, are funny enough and short enough that you don't get too invested. It's long enough that you're expecting a decent laugh at the end, which he does deliver. And that's kind of a theme throughout the special. It's a bit of an awkward middle ground between one-liners and a full-on story, where just as you get invested in the bit, he moves on to another. And it does create a bit of an unusual rhythm to the show, but with his erratic character and his personality, it kind of works, probably as well as it could, but it does feel very weird to watch. Afterwards, he talks about the US government. He plays out a little scenario to illustrate a joke. It works really well, kind of sets up the joke, then plays out the scenario. He talks a little bit about ass in various different ways. This isn't the funniest bit. It's not bad. He tells a story, mixes in some jokes. The end of the bit is really good, but it's kind of average throughout. The next bit is about his parents, and there's a few separate bits kind of all mixed into one here, but they're not really long enough, so they can all fall under the bracket of his parents. But they're all really good. There's a really bizarre part at the end of this bit that I don't want to spoil, but once you look past the weirdness of it, it is actually really well done. It involves a member of the audience to an extent, kind of to the point that you're questioning if it's real, but it's really well done and kind of surprisingly one of the best bits of the show. But it's a really unique thing and something that probably only he or a very select few people could do. But hey, if you're one of those people, you might as well go for it and do it. He then kind of transitions this into talking about religion. It's a very stop-start here. There's some good jokes, but also some that just don't land. He also tells a story with a bit of build-up that just doesn't really pay off at the end. It's probably one of the weaker parts of the show. But he then goes on to talk about texting an old hookup, which has a really good story. He plays off it with some great jokes. It's a really funny story in its own, but the jokes don't overdo it in any way. They still add something to the bit. And coming off what is probably one of the low points of the show, this really helps bring it back up. This brings us to the ending of the show, where he prank texts someone in the audience's mum. This is a really amazing bit. It goes down probably better than he could have expected, and it ends up being the perfect way to end the special. It would have been good anyway, but for what happened to happen when they were filming the special, it was just perfect. I really don't want to spoil this. I would highly recommend that you go and watch the last 10 minutes or so, even if you don't watch the whole special. It's quite hard to talk about it without spoiling it, but just go and watch it. It's probably the perfect way to have ended the special. And as I said, even Eric probably couldn't have hoped for a better way to end. A couple of extra things to mention. In terms of transitions, there's not really any in the show. It's just very blunt cuts from one bit to the next. It's a bit awkward at times, very clunky other times. It kind of works with his style, but the show just doesn't flow well at all. In terms of his stage persona, he's very erratic, very brash. It's a very unique character that's quite hard to explain. He's similar to Theo Von in terms of that uniqueness, but pretty much the opposite in terms of energy levels. It's very high energy, very in your face. And you get an idea of his character very quickly, which is good, but it's not the kind of character that I particularly enjoy in comedy. As for the audience seems very well accustomed to his style. They all react how you would want them to. And for such a bizarre show, the audience does a great job of making it seem quite normal. And that really helps as you're watching, especially if you've not seen him before, which I hadn't. There are also a few bits of audience participation throughout the show, and they all go down really well, and Eric does a really great job of playing off the audience. And finally, some overall thoughts. There were times in the show where Eric really exaggerates to an extreme, and plenty of comedians do this, and at the very best it fits his character and how he sets himself up. But I'm not a fan of it personally. The special in general is really funny, but the format of the show and the style of comedy just doesn't sit right with me for some reason. It's very love-hate, and even though it was funny and there wasn't really any part of the show that I didn't laugh at, I still didn't enjoy it. And it's a bit of a weird one to explain because I 100% get how this could even be someone's favourite special, but it's just not my kind of thing. And because of that, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10 because it was great, but I won't be rewatching it, and I probably wouldn't recommend it to anyone unless you are already a fan of Eric's, in which case I'm sure you'll love it. Thanks for listening to the Stand Up Review podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to get new episodes as soon as they come out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Check out our Patreon for some awesome benefits at patreon.com/standupreview. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for the show, whether it be a new segment or a show you'd like us to review, let us know on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter at Stand Up Review and give us a follow while you're over there. Feel free to share this or any of our other podcasts on any social media platform. Have a great day and we'll see you for the next episode.